But that reminds me of program I did in China in it was like in December of 1999, or was it 2000? I guess maybe. Anyway, and there were three. This was in Beijing, and there were three foreigners. I spoke on technology because the theme of the program was China in the first decade of the new century.
Mm-hmm.
So I spoke on technology, looking at some of the technology trends that were going to come about. The gentleman sitting next to me talked about business trends, and the third fellow, I think, talked about demographic trends or something. Anyway, they stamped out 250,000 DVDs of this thing.
Well, I was looking to see where the can of green tea is, so you didn't knock it over. I didn't want you to not be aware.
It's dangerous in the studio.
Not be aware of that.
Okay, well, we're running, guys. We're here, we're running, we're doing ThinkTech on Friday, the 2 o'clock block. And you guys were kind enough to come down. Thank you very much. Let me do introductions. Mike Sacharski, Ed Kemp, and Roger Ulveling. Now can you say who you really are?
Mike Sacharski?
Good.
I'll try to be Ed Kemp today.
Roger Ulveling.
Okay. All you guys have one thing in common, and that is, among other things, I suppose there's a lot of things you have in common. But one thing in common is that you responded to my article about water. So I want to get your thinking about that. And let me summarize it for you, if I can remember. This was published on Tuesday, which would have been the 16th of April, in the Star Advertiser. And reason I wrote about it is I thought nobody had, so I decided I'd write about it, at least not locally, not recently. And it was entitled originally, because the advertiser always changes the title no matter what you say or do. It's not too early to ensure Oahu's water security. Their title was close to that. And I went into a little about how the global problem was emerging, and it was real serious. And then I said, in Hawaii, we take it for granted. We've had great luck with water in the last couple hundred years. It's been wonderful on water here. But it's not going to be wonderful forever, and we do have problems with big projects. And we better, in a word, we better start planning the next step. Or else the consequences could be disastrous for the lack of water. People don't realize what happens when you don't have clean water. First you get sick, and then you get sicker. And your economy gets real sick in the process.
That's right.
So your thoughts, Mike?
Well, I think and one other thing that attracted me to your article and that I was responding to is I think you also had paid attention in there to energy, and I sort of saw the three fundamental issues facing Hawaii being water, scarcity of water, or how to manage our water, food security, and energy, because they actually overlap in many ways. And I sort of coined a phrase, I guess, on the holy trinity of sustainability issues. And so I see water as a fundamental issue, but also related to the other two, which increases its importance and scope all the more.
Yeah, well, we got to talk about that today. I'm going to put that on a list of things that we have to talk about, the relationship of water and energy, important. Okay, what's the first blush for you, Ed?
Well, my thought was that something you didn't mention in your article was the ability to create water out of the humidity in the air. But the bigger issue related to that is the quality of our water. Right now we've been blessed with good water for many years, and very few people even consider the fact that it could be degraded somewhat. And one of the concerns that I have about that is the chemicals that are being put onto the ground by the big seed companies, which supposedly kill the weeds but don't kill the plants that they're using for seeds. But I can imagine that those herbicides are going to eventually get down to our water supply. And I'm not sure what the impact of that will be, but it seems to me that having water that's generated from the humidity in the air probably bypasses a lot of the potential chemicals and problems that we might have with water that comes out of the ground and through a series of pipes.
Well, that raises two important points we should discuss here today. The condition of the water as it is, and how people take that also for granted. In my research on this, I think I told you, I found that there was we're number 3 in the country on chromium-6. It's carcinogenic.
Right.
And I don't think anybody's disputed that. That's what it is. This is not a comfortable situation. And that, then you think back to heptachlor, back years ago with the
Right.
plantations, and there's all kinds of stuff being fed into the water system that wasn't there at the time Hawaii became a territory, for sure. Roger, what are your thoughts?
Well, one of the things after reading the article to mind is the security of this island. Yes, we have the Board of Water Supply pulling it up from underground, from dike water and so forth, all of which is dependent on electricity. And having been involved in some planning, if there is a tsunami that takes out the Kahe power plant or otherwise disrupts the system, does the Board of Water Supply have backup power facility to keep that pumping? If water lines are damaged in the course of a natural disaster, what do we do? And how many days can we survive on this island before we run out of water?
Ooh, that's one of those chilling questions.
And one of the things that I noticed in your article was that you didn't have anybody from the civil defense to comment on that situation.
Well, we can speculate on what they might say. Do you think there's any backup system for pumping water?
Well, as a former president or CEO of Deep Ocean Hawaii, which was the ship you mentioned.
Oh, yeah, right, the bladder.
Right.
Tell the people what that was.
We were pumping water up from 2,000 feet, running it through reverse osmosis and creating a product that was about equivalent to the water found in your body, about 150 parts per million of total dissolved solids. And the state civil defense was interested in it as long as somebody else was paying for it. The military was interested in it because it was something that could be loaded on their hospital ship and so forth. And the small ship we had, which was 150 feet, could produce as much water as the aircraft carrier in Haiti was putting ashore. And we had a crew of 6. So that it was a lot more economic as far as they were concerned. But the thing that we came across most was that counting all the water in Costco, Walmart, Long's Drug, and so forth, we probably didn't have more than about a 2-day supply here on the islands. And anytime there's a hurricane, tidal wave, storm warning, so forth, if you're an hour or 2 late getting to the store, there isn't any
Nothing
left.
Yeah.
So it's I think a big concern for the state and hasn't been adequately addressed.
This comes to the old bathtub thing,
That's right.
You must keep your bathtub filled with water.
Well, and another factor
Any
is
location.
everybody has a hot water heater, which is another supply of water.
That's true, thank you. See, you learn stuff on ThinkTech. I remember reading about the guys who put that together, that deep sea water thing. You must know them all well. They were, Australians, were they? They were
No.
they were adventurous, as it were.
They were of German descent, but Americans, and professor from the university, and so forth. It was interesting because the Navy, after looking at the system, didn't think it would work because of the pressures at that level, but it was developed in a way that it did work, and it worked well. We ended up selling a lot of the water to China, and it's expensive to transport water, but in their shrimp industry, for example, they were getting a 400% increase in survivability using that water.
Interesting. So tell us about the process you used.
It was just
Desalination on the ship.
on the ship.
And then you carry the water in a big bladder?
We put it into 5,000 gallon bladders in 20-foot containers for its ability to be shipped either inter-island or internationally.
But you had to get the bladder into the container, and then the container would be an ordinary size container?
An ordinary 20-foot container,
Yeah.
right. And we would line them up on a barge, too high, the length of the barge, with an aisle down the center, put the bladders in, and then go along and fill them.
Heavy,
Yes.
very heavy. Well, I'm sure the cost of shipping that much water must be prohibitive.
It's quite expensive, yes. And we were shipping both desalinated water and raw deep ocean water to China. The raw water for the shrimp and the desalinated water for drinking.
Interesting. So was there any, discussion, and I'm very interested in this, you know. Was there any discussion of the mineral, content of the water? 'Cause, it's almost this magic thing about the Nelha water, which is also, I think it's more than 2,000 feet, but
It's about the same, yeah.
Is it really?
It's down below the thermocline, and it's
Down
roughly
below
the
the
same.
thermocline, right? You know about
Yes.
that. Okay. Tell everyone what a thermocline is.
The thermocline is a mixing area within the ocean between the surface water and the deep water, and it has a thermal gradient that goes down at quite a steep slope. And you may recall, it also can deflect sonar and so forth, and you might recall from
Spoken like an old Navy man.
John Wayne movies and so forth, where the submarines would get down below the thermocline in order to not be detected.
Yeah.
But at any rate, the quality of the water is different than the surface. The surface
How is it
water is
different?
more saline because, of course, it's evaporating at a rapid rate. This water works its way up through the thermocline and then to the surface water.
So is this got special minerals? I mean, there's all this talk about
No.
how the water under the thermocline has been under there for a long, long time.
Basically, there is a situation where there are currents that move it from the Arctic and Antarctic around throughout the oceans, and it's melting ice and so forth. But it's still highly saline and needs to go through reverse
But
osmosis.
once you purify it, though, however you do that, it's
We-
supposed to be have different and beneficial content, right? That's how Nelha, what is it, Koyo water, sells so much water in Japan on the claim that this is healthy for you.
Well, it is less saline than the water off of the coast of China, as well as being cleaner. It hasn't been exposed to light and so forth, so you don't have a lot of the organisms in it that you find in warmer water. Its mineral content is somewhat different, and I have heard it said, I'm not an authority on this, that the salt made from that water, which is what's being done in some places, is better for you because it doesn't have as much sodium in it. It has other minerals in it. And so as far as your heart and so forth, it may be better. As I said, I can't verify that, but
That's so interesting.
others that have-
My father-in-law used to go down to the ocean in Kauai, but he had a certain kind of filter, a cloth filter of some kind, and he would get the sea salt. And then he would have a 55-gallon drum cut in half, a big barbecue, and he'd use the sea salt on the steak. And it was really wonderful because big crystals of salt, it had an interesting taste, different than you would buy in the store.
And of course, you can buy sea salt from just about anywhere in the world now in the stores here.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that there's one entrepreneur, he hasn't done it yet, who claims that when he does desalination, he's going to sell the salt for money
Well,
as a
and
byproduct.
Well-
there are certain minerals in the water that we were bringing up that are not as plentiful in the water off of China, and those are ones that were important to the shrimp. I can't recall the exact one at the moment, but that was one of the interesting factors we discovered.
So how come it's over?
Well, the U.S. government changed its policies, and overnight China reacted and changed theirs. And so we went from 30 days in customs in China to 120 days. And we were a young, small company, and we ran out of cash.
Right.
Oh, too bad. Too bad. And what's interesting is that it was an export. And it was not damaging to the, there was no claim that it was damaging to the environment,
No.
was there? That'd be a
No.
silly claim. You know, some people claim that if you desalinate, you're leaving salt behind, and therefore the mixture of the ocean water at that point.
There is a problem with that.
Is that really? Tell us
And
about it.
over in the Mideast, where they have a lot of desalination plants, where they pump the water back into the ocean, it does increase the salinity, and they've had tremendous algae growth as a result of it. And you might get algae blooms 5 miles long.
Oh, because of the additional salt.
Correct.
But in an island in the middle of the ocean, thousands of miles from anywhere else, you're not likely to have that problem.
Yes, the testing and so forth showed that within 10 meters of the vessel, the way we were doing it, which was injecting it down about 20 feet below the vessel, that within 10 meters of the vessel
It was
was
natural again.
undetectable.
Yeah, very interesting that you were involved in that project.
You know, Roger mentioned shortages of drinking water in case of a disastrous event here in Hawaii, and that brings to mind too another potential shortage, and that is in medical water and surgical water. Medical water is used for general medical purposes, and of course surgical water is used for surgery. You have to use those two types of water. And I was involved in a project where a company in California had developed a membrane. I don't know if it was any sort of reverse osmosis or not, but you could take generally ordinary water, even water that may have been polluted to some extent, run it through this membrane, and you had medical grade water, and they were working on developing a membrane for surgical grade water, and this was developed first of all for the U.S. military so they could for battlefield application and places where they'd be in isolation and you couldn't get the medical water in, they could create their own. Well, what it did was to raise the question of, well, worldwide, what is the increasing use of medical water and surgical water, especially in developing countries where the level of medical care is beginning to improve? So you take a country like China, and you can imagine the amount of medical water, surgical water that is required. So when we look at the different uses of water, I think most people are unaware of the many uses of water that makes us even more vulnerable here in Hawaii without some sort of a water program or a plan for addressing these kinds of problems.
It's complex, isn't it?
It is
much more complex than we have been thinking.
Yeah.
Well, it is, and I mean, if you look at the hotels here, all of their backup power supplies and so forth are basically below grade. And if you have a tidal wave, you may not have pumps and so forth to move the water. And then, of course, you've got not only no water for drinking, but you've also got a sewage problem.
There's already a sewage problem in Waikiki. And the
Yes.
EPA has found out about it.
But it creates another one if you've got a high-rise hotel and full of guests.
Oh, sure.
Now, if we have a lot of high humidity, we could maybe pull some water out of that.
These water generators that are available can create up to 1,000 gallons a day out of, these are commercial size units. The ones that I usually am involved in are ones that are available for homes or small offices and things like that. But they do make larger units that can actually make up to 1,000 gallons of water a day. The smaller units make 5 to 7 gallons of water a day. But anything above 30% humidity will allow these machines to create drinking water.
So how much does it cost?
The unit that is typically sold for the house or the small offices is $1,595.
$1,500?
Right. And but we have units that have additional alkaline filters for people that are interested in more alkaline water. That seems to be something that is being promoted.
Why would you want that?
Cancer survives basically in an acidic environment, and there's a lot of research that suggests that if you can make your body more alkaline by eating vegetables and various other ways, you can reduce the potential for cancer. For example, at least one of the major water suppliers in this island sells alkaline water as an alternative to the regular water and charges a premium for it. So there is some research that suggests that alkaline water is beneficial for your health. And so these units that I'm involved with typically are about a 7.5 pH, which is close to the body's pH. But the more alkaline units can get to 9.5 or even
A little
10.5.
switch on there?
No, you just add additional mineral filters. But these are natural methods of getting to alkaline water. There are units that come from Japan, for example, the Kangen unit, which essentially takes water from your tap and through a series of electronic devices and so forth, creates alkaline water. But the ones that I'm involved with create alkaline water through actual good minerals, magnesium, potassium, calcium, and so forth.
As an additive?
As an additive.
Yeah, because I mean, ordinarily, you take water out of the air, there are no minerals in it. It's pure
That's right.
condensed water from the
That's
air. Query, what exactly is surgical and medical water, and can Ed's machine satisfy the need for surgical and medical water? It sounds like it could, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the fundamental difference, of course, is that the surgical water is used for irrigation of wounds or during surgery, and has to be extremely pure because of potential infection.
Distilled.
That sort of thing, yes. And then the medical water is more general usage for cleaning instruments and that sort of thing.
But still has to be
Yeah.
very
That's one of the
pure.
things about the deep ocean water, where you don't have any of the bacteria and so forth, that you can take it down to those levels.
Well, the thing about, yeah, I mean, we're talking about two different kinds of processes.
Right.
One, you're taking the water out of the air.
Right.
That's, pure distillation, essentially. I mean, there's lots of ways to distill, but that's certainly one of them. And in the case of the desalination, such as deep water Hawaii, deep ocean Hawaii, you still have the water you started with, but the salt has been screened out by
The
these
salt and other minerals, right.
semi-permeable membranes. But to the extent those membranes don't catch an antigen in there, you get the antigen.
At that level, you don't have them.
Right, exactly.
That's
But if you
the starting
applied
point
that
is,
toward surface water,
Right.
you would have antigens
could,
in there,
yes.
yeah.
right,
So that was the benefit of the deep sea aspect
Yes.
of it, yeah.
right. One of the things that didn't come up, you know that we have a lot of kidney dialysis facilities on this island, and they use a lot of water,
And they're increasing, I understand.
and they're increasing.
Well, why?
Because there are a lot of Pacific Islanders and others that have renal problems.
I'm just wondering if the quality of our water is giving us kidney problems to start with.
No, I don't think that's it. But one of the things is that in the event of an emergency again, you have a large demand there and a short period of time that they have to be able to react. Some of the companies that we talked to, their solution was to look for the closest fire hydrant. But if there's no power
Right.
and so forth, due to either a hurricane or a tsunami that knocks out something, that's not going to hack it, and there's a problem.
Well, let's talk for a minute about, at least what I was thinking about when I wrote the article, namely the condition of the aquifers, the quality of the water in the aquifers, how the aquifers work, how sea changes change the quality of the waters in the aquifers, and what we're going to do about water security given those processes. I mean, any thoughts about that? You want to talk about aquifers? Do you know about aquifers from your life at sea, so to speak?
Not a lot, but obviously in this island, the rain percolates through the earth
It's porous. We have special soil which
it's
gives us
porous.
a benefit, so it goes into the
And
aquifer.
it has both a filtration process,
Yeah.
but any dissolved minerals might also carry down, hence the
Sure.
question that Ed brought up on the quality of, and what happens with
Sure.
pesticides and so
Sure,
forth.
sure.
So it's, we've already, as you pointed out, had a heptachlor problem with chemicals, and that could happen again with a different type of chemical, and probably will as farming changes and the types of fertilizers or other applications that go into it.
I'll tell you a story about heptachlor. My firm was representing Foremost Dairies, and right after the thing hit the newspaper, everybody was embarrassed about the heptachlor. And I went out there to meet with my client, who was out near the prison. I don't know if it's still there. And the secretary to my client was very dutiful and everything. She said, "Good morning, Mr. Fidell. Would you wait for Mr. Jones over here? He'll be in a minute. In the meantime, would you like a cup of coffee or tea?" I said, I'll have coffee. She said, "Would you like milk or cream in the coffee?" I said, "I'll have milk in the coffee. Would you like the milk skimmed or regular milk in the coffee?" I said, I'll have regular milk in the coffee. She says, "Would you like your regular milk with or without heptachlor?" This is a true story. It was pretty funny. I don't think we took it all as serious as maybe we should have at the time, but over time, the plantations let a lot and leached a lot of chemicals into the aquifers, and we had the benefit of that. The other aspect to it, though, is that when seawater comes up, the seawater meets the fresh water in the aquifer, and I forget the name of it's called a lens.
Right.
And the lens is shaped like a lens.
Right.
And on the top of the lens is the fresh water, and the
Floats
bottom
on the salt water.
Okay, and the lens changes with the quality of the water on both sides of it, okay? And if you overpump and you take all the fresh water out, and this happens all around the world, then you damage the aquifer, you damage the lens, you damage the ability of the land to hold water in the porous spaces, and that sometimes can't be fixed. And the question is, when do you reach the point when you're overpumping to damage? And that could happen here.
Well, and also, the further inland you go, the deeper the lens of fresh water, so that it's relatively thin as you get toward the ocean, and it builds up and then back down. And the old Hawaiian wells were inland from the ocean, but not very far, and they captured the fresh water that floated on the salt water. Yes, you can damage the lens.
Now, the other thing is that as sea change rises, as the sea level rises because of climate change is already having an effect on the water supply in the world. But here in Hawaii, when the sea level rises, it rises into the aquifers. And now, instead of having what you thought was fresh water that you could pump out, you have brackish.
That's right.
And this is a big problem.
We talk about this problem in the world, but this problem is part of the United States, too.
Sure.
I forget exactly who it was, but a couple of years ago bought water resources in the Midwest with the idea of pipelining it down to Texas. And I think one of the things one has to worry about in that is then what happens to the breadbasket of the country. It's great that Texas may need water, but we already see the problem with the Colorado River and the diversions to California and so forth. I was reading an article the other day that said by the time it reaches Mexico, there's no more water. It's all been taken out.
That's why San Diego is building this Poseidon plant that I mentioned in the article. Anyway, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that what's interesting too, I think, is the diversity of water distribution on each island, going back to aquifers. And you have areas of some islands where you've got heavy concentration of aquifers in one area of the island, and then other areas of the island they have to depend on surface water and so forth. And then as population patterns begin to emerge, how to get the water from point A to point B, coming back to the the water management companies that have to put in the infrastructure to do this. And so it's not one size fits all. Each island, I think, has its own unique characteristics and maybe peculiarities about its water supply.
Well, certainly the island of Lanai is probably most unusual, because the Norfolk Island pines that they specifically planted there take the moisture out of the air and drips down to the ground, and that's how their water supply is
Yeah,
replenished.
along the hillside on the north coast. But that's probably why Larry Ellison wants to build a desalination
Well,
plant.
that's right. There's still only a
This is-
limited
there are
amount of water
issues.
that comes that way.
You know, what I find interesting is that they had agriculture there, I mean, large quantities of pineapple. And apparently they were able to do that. I'm not sure how things have changed, but now his view of it is he wants to, renew agriculture on the island, but he needs more water to do that.
I've read a report showing what the output of the different wells on Lanai were, and which ones they had to throttle back and so forth. And the problem is, that a couple staying in a resort may use more water showering, going to the bathroom and so forth, than the pineapple plant.
I think
and so
tourism
that-
uses a lot of water.
It does.
You know.
And so that's an issue. If they're going to expand tourism on that island, the water resources are probably not enough.
And if they're going to expand agriculture on that island. In
And
fact,
they
if
want to
we're
do that
going
as
to
well.
have agriculture in the state of Hawaii, we have to allow for that.
That's right.
And what I find very interesting, this is sort of like the connection between energy and water, and the connection between water and agriculture, food. I find it very interesting that when the Board of Water Supply had a big project in Kalaeloa, this was 5 million gallons a day. That's bigger than your condenser. They worked on it for 5 years or more. Oceanit, the company
Yes,
Oceanit
right.
was their consultant, their technical consultant. They had a whole plan going, and they were going to build this thing. It was going to be a $40 million project, and it was really going to deliver water to the Board of Water Supply. But they stopped in 2008. Hard to say whether that was a rational or an engineering or a political,
Or economic.
decision. But one of the reasons that they gave was, we found, they said, that in fact, people in Oahu are using less water. Okay, and I find that very interesting, because it was at the same moment that Linda Lingle and government in general was talking about expanding local agriculture. So they made the claim that because of the plantations, the end of plantations and sugar and pineapple, and we need less water, therefore we don't need a desalination plant. Okay, in fact, they wanted to increase agriculture back again. So, I mean, what it is if you make these decisions based on, we want to say, issues of the moment, considerations of the short-term considerations, or worse, political considerations, you never have the chance to really do water security. Because to build a desalination plant like that takes 10 years.
Right.
And so we lost that opportunity. It's gone now.
I understand from the research that was made at the time when the sugarcane was phased out, that in fact there was more water that was available for homes, because homes used less water than sugarcane. Sugarcane used so much water for irrigation, and so much of it evaporated, that when they put in homes in the same area, it actually used less water. So
Interesting.
that perhaps was something to do with that decision.
Yeah.
Of course, the way they irrigated the sugar cane was simply to open the sluice and
But they
run
had,
lots
but
of
they had
water.
the sluice.
Yes.
The plantations had a very powerful system of irrigation.
Oh, absolutely. But what I mean is, if you were to go to some means of applying the water directly to the roots of the plant, like they're doing with the grape industry in California, it uses considerably less water than flooding down rows of cane.
Well, a lot of that is energy efficiency.
Yeah, it's true.
And nobody worried about things when there was sufficient water.
Right.
Well, some of it came through the tunnel from the windward side, because there was an excess of water
Here
over
in
there.
Oahu.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that was utilized for years by the plantations and by people who needed water.
And now, of course, they want to retain more of that water on the windward side for plants.
The other thing that didn't get taken into consideration in that decision in 2008, it seems to me, is that in the world today, the amount of, despite the phenomenon you describe, in the world today, the amount of water that people use per capita is much greater than it used to be. You know, as as our civilization gets more complex, as our daily activities get more complex, we use more water, not only for household, but everything. And so in the future, predictably, we'll continue to use more water. Where are we going to get it?
Let me add a comment on that, on energy. There's a large photovoltaic system that was planned to go into an area that's in California, close to the Nevada border, in that area, Southern California. And one of the things, it's an agricultural community. And apparently the photovoltaic plant would use something like half to 60% of all the water available, because they have to keep cleaning the lenses. And of course, that caused a great uproar with the farmers.
That's another relationship.
Yes.
You brought this point up in the first place, the
Yeah.
connection.
Yeah, and another example is that there is what I call a water tax every time you use your cell phone or you send a text message, because the data centers, we don't have a large data center here in Hawaii, but when you get on the mainland or you get into countries like China, where they have enormous data centers that all the traffic passes through that data center, and of course the data centers generate tremendous heat, and generally speaking 25% of the total cost of operating a data center is keeping it cool.
Right.
And the equipment is so fine in its performance that a half a degree up, half a degree down, and you begin to experience rolling breakdowns in the data center. And the only way they can keep these data centers cool is through building these enormous chillers that use water. And they use enormous amounts of water. There's no industrial air conditioning system that can keep these data centers cool like water can. And in China now, they're realizing that. I mean, they're realizing the relationship between data traffic and the use of water, and energy, of course, is embedded in there. And so during prime time, such as Spring Festival and other peak periods during the year, they're beginning to limit the number of text messages, the number of phone calls
Interesting. Oh, my
that
goodness.
you can make within a given, like 48-hour period. And the last number I heard, so it may have changed, but this was about a year or so ago, I think you were limited to like 2,500, 250, well, not, they wouldn't do 250 in China, but you were limited to 200, let's say, and 225 text messages within like 24 hours or 48 hours, and so many phone, and if you exceeded that, you lost your phone service for 6 months.
Jeez.
Wow. And I think we're gonna, when I say we, globally, I think we're gonna see more and more limits being reached. And because those limits are being reached, what people typically think is infinite, such as I've got a total data plan, I can talk forever and only pay $49 a month. No, you cannot, because the transmission is limited. And then you get down to keeping the data center cool. And so here's where the interconnectedness then begins to really come into play.
And that's actually happening with some of the US carriers now, where you have an unlimited plan, and they're trying to force you onto plans that have limits. And if you're on the unlimited plans, things start going slower once you hit a certain point.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that's just an accident.
Yes, I'm sure it is, but it happens with a lot of people in Silicon Valley that
This
I've talked
raises the
with.
point that you made earlier, though, Mike, and that is, distinguishing one type of water from another. I had lunch with a guy just now, and we talked about distinguishing one type of energy from another, one kind of electricity from another. I'm not talking about the source, but the product.
Right.
Because, you don't want to use the finest kind of you want that for your computers. But, I don't know, to run something that's not a chiller, for example, you don't need fancy electricity, and you don't need fancy water either for the chiller. It's second tier, or maybe the third
I
tier.
have an electric toothbrush. So-
Okay, I don't.
So,
Yeah.
I think that would be an example where you could use some low-grade electricity
Doesn't matter, yeah.
for your toothbrush.
It's just feeding the
Right now,
battery
I'm using-
anyway, it
right.
doesn't matter. So anyway, so that sort of takes us to this whole issue of, medical water and surgical water and water to run the chillers and condensed water for one. There's different kinds of water. And water for agriculture, it's different. And that's one of the points that the Board of Water Supply made, that, what they do is and one of the reasons they dropped the project was that they found that they could recycle water. I mean, I wouldn't want to be there when this happens. Recycle water for agriculture. I think it's a golf course.
And for golf courses,
Golf course, yeah.
primarily.
And recycled water, where it comes from. It's waste water. It's not
It's
pretty.
partially treated.
Partially treated water, yeah. So it's the same thing, you have this grade and you have that grade. And if you want to be efficient, you have to allocate the right grade to the right use.
Of course, that was done to some extent by the plantations, because they developed cane specific to locations. And for example, at one point on Kauai, I think in Kekaha area or so forth, they were using 700 parts per million of chlorides in water, which was pretty brackish, but it's, 75% more than the highest level for potability. And other places, the water was better. But they developed cane based on the types of water that they had in various places.
Well, looking forward now, what interests me about your condensation machines, which I guess in some places they'll be very popular. And I have read that desalination machines come in all sizes now. And there are companies out there that are manufacturing them left and right for private homes, which are in remote places and so forth. So what that allows for, which is like different than in the past, is the distribution of water-producing devices around the community. And they're no longer necessarily connected as a utility would connect, just like electricity. I mean, you can be off the grid now. You can find a very sophisticated gizmo, that will a PV in your backyard, that will allow you to function without being on the grid. You can also find one of these condensation devices that will allow you to have, an adequate water for your household without being connected to the Board of Water Supply. What is the future going to hold?
Well, I think it's going to hold a mixture of a lot of things. I think the prospect of actually generating enough water through these devices to be able to utilize for showers and for toilets and things like that is probably a little unrealistic. But certainly for cooking and for drinking and areas where good water is necessary, I think something like this kind of a machine has an opportunity to provide great benefits. Places that are in drought status on the Big Island and on Maui, the catchment areas up in Round Top and Tantalus, it seems like they could benefit from from these machines because they do not have a good supply of water that's available to them. And so I think that there's an opportunity here for a variety of kinds of water. There's a program at the moment where a company is taking water, deep sea water, out of the ocean, and they're going to use it to cool buildings in downtown Honolulu.
Sure. Honolulu seawater air conditioning.
Right, and that is another type of water which doesn't require super good water. It's basically just
Fresh.
Fresh.
Just has to be fresh.
That's right. So I think there's going to be a whole variety of solutions to the problem of water.
Grading, where
Right.
you like you go into the market and you see the label on the back. Now you'll see a label on your water. Well, you'll know.
And some hotels are using partially treated or fully treated water for these flushing and so forth, and only using the city water for drinking and showers.
You know, when I met Mike, which the year 2004, you may not remember that far back.
No.
Mike and I did a radio show. We tried to do a radio show in the offices, the studio of the BBC in Beijing. It was quite something, because they cut our line. The Chinese come and cut our line. They were worried what he was going to say. Anyway, in that trip, there was the High-Tech Development Corporation was involved, and in that trip we had a lot of panoply with a band, a Chinese band that was playing for us, you know, in the state of Hawaii. And it really amazed me that the band was standing out there with their instruments, and every man jack in the band had a little bottle of water on the deck next to him. I mean, everybody in China, you tell me, everybody in China does that. They carry around water with them, right? And
Yes,
maybe it's
bottled
happening
water,
here
not
too
tap
now.
water.
Yeah.
But is that the way it's going to be going forward?
Well, yeah, I think, you know, going back to what you were mentioning a moment ago about basically what I think is individualization. Technology is allowing for individualization, so you can acquire certain fundamental capabilities that you don't have to rely on, you don't have to be on the grid, or you don't have to go to the general service provider. So as we get more and more into individualization, it's going to be interesting to see the different collection of sort of galaxies and sub-galaxies of technology applications out there, and you and your neighbor and all the other people up and down the street may be living, each of you using different technologies but achieving the same end result.
I spent 4 years in France between high school and college.
I am envious.
But during that time, you quickly realized that nobody drank the water out of the regular water system. Zero. You either drank Perrier or Evian or some bottled water, or wine or champagne or whatever. But the point is, you didn't drink.
Let them eat cake, you know.
You never touched the water that came from the tap. That was used for showers and various other things, but you did not drink it. And hopefully that doesn't happen in Hawaii or any place that I want to live. But the point is that may occur at some point, that we may be stuck with a quality of water that we get from our taps that is not sufficiently good for drinking. And we may have to use reverse osmosis filters or some other kind of way to get to the kind of water that we can drink safely.
Yeah, well, it would be really too bad in this sense.
Yes.
I mean, I believe in community. I believe, especially in Hawaii, I want to see the Hawaii community come together and be one, be unified on as many things as possible. And sometimes I really wonder if that's ever going to happen. But water somehow is the lifeblood of our community. It links us. And if we could all turn on the tap and get reasonably good water, we're somehow participating in a community experience around water. Water has always had a special, almost religious quality to it. You know, think of all the rituals that use water.
Yes.
What I want to ask you guys, one last question in our remaining time is what should we do? What should we do? We have issues around water quality, issues around water security. We have issues around, you know, coming together on things, deciding whether it should be, you know, a community thing or a distributed system. What should we do here to make sure that we are never undermined by the lack of fresh, drinkable water and medical water? You know?
It seems to me that we have to define the space that we want that security in. And if it's 100% and we're unwilling to take any kind of risk of whatever, then there's a cost to that. If we say, okay, we want to be able to endure the 75-year storm instead of the 100-year storm or whatever, that's a lesser cost. And I think as a community, we have to decide that. And then, of course, it becomes the problem of economically taking care of it.
And finding political will to
And political
decide on
will,
a single
to worry
choice.
about the future generation.
Yeah, so what do you recommend?
Well, I think it needs to be a publicized issue, so that the
We're doing
community
that
becomes
now,
aware.
actually, Roger.
Yes, but on a more enduring manner than one show.
Okay, fair enough.
And I think it needs to be discussed in the legislature, and I think that the civil defense needs to have an input.
Would you spend $40 million on probably the cost is much more for the same plant now, but would you spend 40 and going up on a desalination plant for West Oahu? And only 5 million, 5 million gallons is peanuts compared to the state's use.
That's right.
I believe the state's use is something like 200 million per day.
That's probably right.
And our capacity, they say, is 250, but that's a narrowing gap,
Yes, and it involves all kinds of things from, do we limit growth so that we can live within the water system we've got? Do we decide we want to expand and we want to add hotels out there to a greater extent? In which case, yes, it may be necessary. Then the question is, does it become part of the responsibility of the developers? Or is it solely the responsibility of the Board of Water Supply and the city and county? How do we want to address that? And of course, it's a question of tax versus cost of the product.
But wouldn't you ascribe to the notion, I mean, looking at this from an accounting point of view, is if it ain't broke, why fix it? Everything seems to be working fine right now.
Well, it seems to be, but I think it's prudent to actually think about the possibilities of it not working and trying to figure out some way in which we can prepare for that. One of the ways, which is sort of this interrelated issues between electricity and water and so forth that you were mentioning, was that when Kauai experienced a huge problem with the hurricane, the Navy sent a ship over, nuclear-powered ship, that could have generated enough power for that island immediately, but there was no plug. There was no way to transfer that energy from that nuclear-powered ship to that island, and there still isn't today. It seems to me that we have 3 nuclear-powered submarines, particularly in Pearl Harbor, constantly. We need to have a plug so that in emergency they can provide some power to this island and to the other islands if necessary, so that the water supply can continue to run.
Of course, I'm not sure that's a lot different than what happened in Haiti, where they brought the aircraft carrier in. They had a hose that was pumping 200,000 gallons of water a day, and they were trying to fill 5-gallon containers.
Yeah.
Takes a while. Well, you talk about the usefulness of nuclear energy. This is another discussion altogether.
Of
But
course.
why just limit yourself to the plug? Why don't you have a small reactor there too? Then you wouldn't have to worry about the submarines. But we'll discuss that later. What do you think, Mike?
Well, I think we need to start thinking about the unthinkable. And when I was a young university student, I was impressed by a writer at the time, Herman Kahn, and he came out with a book on thermonuclear war, and the title was Thinking the Unthinkable. Mm-hmm. And he called into question a lot of the conventional wisdom of the 1950s about thermonuclear war, and basically said you have to think about these unthinkable things. And I think we're at that point in Hawaii where we need to think the unthinkable, and I think that unthinkable is in areas such as population. How much activity, how much more activity do we want to try and sustain? How much independence do we want to have for our food? Those kinds of questions. Because water is not something that can be recreated. You can't create a synthetic water like you can create a synthetic oil or petroleum or a lot of other synthetic fibers.
Give me some hydrogen, I'll make some
But
for you.
or out of the air, Ed. But generally speaking, no one's come up with that solution yet. So it's so it's a very, very precious item, and it's forcing us now, I think, going back to your prudence, to begin thinking the unthinkable and talk about I think you just mentioned a moment ago about making some of these issues public. And we're at that point where they have to become public, and not only to discuss, but to take action, because I don't believe that there's much time remaining before we pass over that threshold where we're not going to be able to have the choices later on that we have in front of us now.
We've had people in the past in Hawaii, Alvy Wright was one, that was always thinking 25 years hence. And in the last decade, I can't think that we've had very many people that have been espousing what we might run into and how we ought to deal with it, thinking that far in advance. And I recall the government has had some conferences that try to address the future, but I'm not sure that we've come up with any courses of action or solutions, only, yeah, we could have a problem.
So asking the hardest question of all, Ed, this one's for you, at least to start. Aside from your aspirations and your wishful thinking on the subject, what do you think is really going to happen? Be cruel, be candid.
Well, I'm concerned that that if we don't run out of fresh water, which is a possibility, I suppose, if we pump too much, we at least will run the risk of contaminating the water that we have. And I think we should prepare for that alternative by choosing to find alternative sources of drinking water through desalinization, through dehumidification, through various other means. But I think we need to prepare for that, because I think it's a very good possibility that it's going to happen.
When?
I understand it takes like 100 years for the water to filter through the entire lava rock and so forth down to the lens. I'm not sure that's the correct number, but it's apparently a very long time. So we may not have an immediate problem with all these pesticides and herbicides that are being utilized. Even the medicine that we take, a lot of that gets into the landfills and goes down.
Sure.
There's a lot of things that can contaminate our water.
Well, maybe it'll help.
Maybe it will. But I'm concerned. I think hopefully it'll be beyond my lifetime, but I'm concerned about my kids and grandkids as well. So I'm hopeful that we'll find some alternatives and not just allow this to happen to us without any thought.
Okay, Mike, you have the final word.
Okay.
So what do you think is really going to happen here?
What I think is going to happen is that the problem's going to be ignored, and it's going to be confronted too late. And as a result, I think you're going to see a big out-migration from the state, because we won't be able to sustain the population anymore. And don't forget, our nearest neighbor is California, which also by that time is going to have severe water problems. So it's going to make the out-migration even more difficult, because people are going to have to go further east than California, so it's not that easy. But I see, generally speaking, a constriction of the economy, a constriction of the way we live, as this problem becomes greater, and as I said, we pass over the threshold where we can't solve it anymore. And I would think, based on what I've seen in China, where I've spent a lot of time, and have witnessed what's happened there with regard to water issues, that Hawaii could very likely, by 2035, be in very, very serious situation.
Interestingly enough, that's the year that they used when they made this analysis. They said we're good until 2035. Funny you should come up with that year. So, can you say reverse osmosis?
Can I say it?
Yeah.
Reverse osmosis?
What role does it play here?
I think that obviously it's a tried and true method of fixing or taking water and taking minerals out of it to make it potable water. It's worked well. Does require power, energy to do it,
Plenty.
plenty, but it works, and it works well.
Okay.
We're probably more fortunate being in the middle of an ocean in terms of the dispersal of the brine portion, but I think that just as Larry Ellison is planning it, I think we're going to see it on other islands, probably this island first.
So, go ahead.
If
sir.
I can add just one thing quickly that I sort of left out of my remarks a moment ago, and that is, I think too, there may be, and should be, and I would expect there would be, wisdom in what the ancient Hawaiians did for water usage and conservation. I think to a great extent they were great hydrologists, and they understood the workings of the islands and sort of the natural plumbing that we have here. And so I would, in any attempt to solve our problem, I would look back as well as look forward to see what we can learn from what the Hawaiians did in their management of water, and see how those lessons can be applied to some of the technology solutions, applications that we have today.
Great discussion, you guys. You know, it's almost completely spontaneous, this discussion. It's wonderful to have this conversation with you. Thank you, Roger Ulveling. Great. And Ed Kemp, thank you very much. And by the way, how do you say reverse osmosis in French?
Je ne sais pas.
And thank you, Mike Sacharski.
Okay, my
Great,
pleasure.
you guys.
Okay.
It's been wonderful. What a trip. Aloha.
Aloha.
That was interesting.
I was tempted to put in a shameless plug for my